Hello, it's John Heaton, and today I'm going to review the Beatles' last released album, Let It Be, the penultimate to be recorded. And I'm redoing this review because a few years ago I did a review of this album, and I tried to go downtown and film it in a picturesque setting, and it was that all right. It was down by the Danube with the Parliament opposite, but I didn't have a microphone, and the traffic of the main road was extremely loud, and so I had to shout to be heard, and it was pretty unpleasant listening by all accounts. So quite a few people over the years have been asking me to redo it, and I've been asking myself to do it, and I finally got round to doing it. I mean, I could have obviously waited for the movie Let It Be to be released, or the 50th anniversary, which will presumably come next year, but I thought there's no point in hanging around. We'll do it. So I'm going to go through quite a lot of information to get through here. I'm going to go through stuff chronologically. So the first track to be worked on for this Let It Be project was Across the Universe in February of '68, and it was a contender for the Beatles single follow-up to Hello Goodbye. The Beatles were not particularly happy with the recording of that version of the song, and it was kind of put on the shelf and not done anything with until John and the Beatles gave it to the World Wildlife Fund, and it appeared as the opening track on their charity album with added bird noises. So the '68 recording is a little bit lacking, because the female vocalists are just two fans grabbed off they were hanging around outside the studio, and they were just grabbed and told to sing Nothing's Going to Change My World. So that was far from polished, and one doesn't really need a couple of amateur female girls singing along on a Beatles track. So that, from that perspective, it didn't work too well as a recording. But as we'll see, when it comes to the final album, I think it's a glorious track, and the best version of the three versions out there is this one, and also the Let It Be Naked one without the strings. But I am one of the people who thinks Phil Spector's strings add to the charm of some of the songs on this Let It Be album. Not everyone likes the song Across the Universe. Lennon thought it was one of his best ever lyrics, but in this book, which is quite a good book on the whole, Ian MacDonald, Revolution in the Head, for some reason he absolutely lays into this track and says, after the aggressive sarcasm of I Am the Walrus, it is sad to find Lennon some months and several hundred acid trips later chanting this plaintively babyish incantation. His most shapeless song, Across the Universe, like In My Life a Nowhere Man, came out of a mentally drained state in the early hours of the morning, a trance-like succession of trochees which presently extended to 3 verses. Lennon was impressed with this lyric, trying on several later occasions to write in the same metre. Sadly, its amorphous pretensions and listless melody are rather too obviously the products of acid grandiosity rendered gentle by sheer exhaustion. And he goes on to say, while a Beatle, Lennon was rarely boring. He made an unwanted exception with this track. I'm sorry to give so much publicity to Ian MacDonald's book, because that is nothing far short of a scandalous opinion. Of course, everyone's entitled to their opinion, but Across the Universe is a glorious track, lyrically, melodically, and spiritually. I haven't got a bad word to say about it, and I'm staggered that Ian MacDonald felt that way. Anyway, then what happened in January the 2nd, 1969, the Beatles decided, as a follow-up to the White Album, that they thought they were missing... I'm sorry, I'll be trying to come up with new information, because a lot of you know all this information already, but Paul thought that they would get back into the studio and record an album live to get the kind of sound and the feel of a live band again, and possibly end it with a concert. And they were thinking of all kinds of locations in Africa, which didn't come to anything. And then someone, I think Paul maybe, had the idea just to go onto the roof of the Apple building. So this album was recorded between January the 2nd and January the 31st, 1969, in the basement of 3 Savile Row, which was the newly created Apple Studios. Previously they'd shot some of the film footage at Twickenham Studios, but none of that found its way onto the album because the sound quality, if you watch the movie, the sound quality is noticeably starker and less impressive than it was in the Apple basement. So I guess the recording equipment left something to be desired, but I think in Twickenham they were just running through stuff and rehearsing rather than recording finished takes. So in that sense it's understandable, but still there's a big difference in quality of the recorded output between Twickenham and Apple. So, and the Beatles got fed up with Twickenham, and the film, by the way, to this day unreleased. I've done a couple of videos about bemoaning that fact, but there's nothing we can do. And apparently it's being redone, but don't hold your breath. So what do we say? So halfway through January they moved from Twickenham and went to Apple, and then they decided to do the final concert on the roof of Apple. And as I think I've mentioned in a previous video, the 3 Savile Row Apple headquarters, the Beatles headquarters, from 68 until they split, and then carried on going until 1975, the studios, in 1976 I think the building closed down and Apple moved. But that 3 Savile Row is now an Abercrombie kids clothes shop, which you can go into and visit as a member of the public and walk around and try and find, which was the office of Derek Taylor, the press officer, where all the fun went on by all accounts. I think John had an office overlooking the street. I'm not sure about the others, but it's a good atmosphere going to that building, even if it is a clothes shop now. And still, one gets a sense of history just walking up the stairs, and I think it's probably been completely refurbished, so the stairs are probably completely new and not bearing too much resemblance to how it used to be. But still recommend, if any of you in the London area, it's just between Oxford Street and Regent Street, in one of those back streets in the tailoring district of the West End of London, Savile Row. You can look it up. And so the first product to come out of these sessions was the Get Back single. This is not the original. This is the 1976 reissue, the green cover on the Apple label, and produced by George Martin. And one has to say, a bit of a blot on George Martin's copybook here, because he doesn't do a fantastic job on either track, particularly on Get Back. The production is far too echoey, and Paul's voice is not loud enough, and the guitar's not loud enough. It doesn't rock half as loud as it does on the final album version or on the Let It Be Naked version. And I don't know what George Martin was doing, but he rather messed up on this track, in my opinion, which is very rare because his production on Beatles albums was second to none almost the whole time. So then, chronologically speaking, if we go through it, the Beatles were going to recreate the front cover of Please Please Me as the album cover for this new album, and so this was going to be it. And I think I'm right in saying this particular first attempt at shooting the balcony shot was taken by Linda, with George in the red coat. And then they weren't obviously not happy with it, so they got professional photographer Angus McBean to go back a week or two later, May the 13th, 1969, my 5th birthday. They recorded this Momentous Shot, which was supposed to be the front cover, and this was supposed to be the back cover. So you can see it shaping up to, this ended up being the front cover or something similar. And then, so that wasn't used, and then eventually that back cover turned up as the back cover to this 73 compilation that Alan Klein put together. And this is his greatest contribution to Beatles history, as I've said before, the fact that he put these albums together, not just the track selection and the fact that they exist, the red and the blue, they're timeless, but in the fact that the sleeve, it just encapsulates the Beatles' 6 years, the difference between 63 and 69, perfectly. Subtly different shot, if you look, subtly different, not much difference. Anyway, so this album was supposed to come out. It was produced by Glyn Johns and George Martin, although George Martin's not even credited on, this is a bootleg copy. produced for disc by George Martin, and Glyn Johns helped out, but I think Glyn Johns actually did more than just help out. I think he was the de facto producer, because George Martin was not around for a lot of these sessions. They were quite unhappy sessions, although not that unhappy. As people have pointed out, there were some happy moments, and this bootleg has some superb footage of them rehearsing the song Get Back and rehearsing the song For You Blue, and they're laughing their heads off. Literally, Leonard's trying to nail the harmony vocal on the Get Back second chorus, and getting quite frustrated at not being able to nail it. And Paul McCartney's telling stories of how Jimmy Nicol was on tour with them, and he used to scare Jimmy by shouting 1, 2, and Jimmy would go like that and think he had to start a song or something. So all the other Beatles were laughing their heads off at that story, and Billy Preston. So this bootleg is superb in terms of the quality's not great, but in terms of the footage which is out there. So this was mixed by Glyn Johns. This is sleeve notes from Mal Evans, which appeared in the Beatles Monthly magazine, track by track listing of who wrote what and who plays on what, I think. This was signed on the back by Charles Lennon, Lennon's uncle, and by Ray Coleman, the author, at a Beatles convention in 1984, I think it was. So that album didn't see the light of day because they weren't happy with Glyn Johns' work. Then he went back and did a second version, which he gave to them in January 1970, which was also rejected. And then Phil Spector was brought in, and it finally came out as this album in May of 1970. And this was one of the first albums I ever picked up. It's got a rather mischievous sleeve note on the back, because it wasn't really a New Phase Beatles album, as it says. It was actually going to be their swan song. But George Martin was told he was not going to get a credit on this album, although I think he says thanks to George Martin at the bottom. And so George Martin said, he said, I produced the original. What you should say is produced by George Martin, overproduced by Phil Spector. So George Martin was not impressed by what Phil Spector did. Neither was Paul McCartney, but the other three Beatles were, particularly John Lennon. In the Rolling Stone interview, he says, let me give you the quote. He was given the shittiest load of badly recorded shit with a lousy feeling to it ever, and he made something out of it. I mean, it wasn't fantastic, but when I heard it, I didn't puke. So, and I agree. I think it's far superior to the Glyn Johns version. Although we'll never know, I guess, because the Glyn Johns one I have here is a bootleg, not particularly good quality, as all bootlegs tend to be. So this is on the Apple label. Didn't come with any inner sleeve or anything. UK Apple. The American copy came with a poster, which I have somehow acquired over the years, and so I have it here. Oh, this is the inner sleeve, sorry. And then the poster, which I'm not going to open out because it literally is falling to bits. That was in the US version, and the UK version originally came out in a box, a very expensive box with a book which came with it, which is this book, which I've bought separately. You can't buy this box, well, you can buy it, but virtually not for love or money. It costs a fortune. And even back in the day, in the 90s, 80s, when I started collecting Beatles, it was 200 quid back then, so God knows what it costs now. This version of the book is not in great shape. Pages are falling out, so I dare not open too much of it. But just suffice to say that there are some very nice pictures in here, some of which are quite rare. And so I if one had been far-sighted in 1970, one would not have complained about the box set and would have bought 5 of them, opened one and kept 4 in mint condition. But one doesn't have the benefit of hindsight, I suppose. So what else can I say? The rooftop concert, January the 30th, 1969. I was trying to, and the Ruttles in their film did a superb mock-up of that when they sung Get Up and Go, which was very similar to Get Back, and they dressed up just as the Beatles had dressed up, and it was hilarious. But John was very down on the sessions. You couldn't make music at 8 in the morning or 10 or whatever it was, coloured lights. I just wanted them to go away. George called it the low of all lows, or something similar. He was in a good mood after recording with Bob Dylan and the band over Christmas '68, came back quite revitalised to the Beatles sessions in Twickenham, and was quickly disillusioned when he argued with Paul, as one can see in the film. And he also argued with John, which was not in the film. On January the 10th, he actually picked up his guitar and said, "See you around the clubs," and just went home and left the Beatles for a couple of weeks, and wrote the song Wah Wah. But one has never got to the bottom of just how serious this argument he had with John. I think it was more the fact that John was disinterested and didn't really show any interest in George's compositions, which is certainly true around this period. He didn't really, even a song like All Things Must Pass, he hardly contributed to. Barely could bring himself to work on a Paul song, but when it came to George, he was not very tolerant at all, should we say, and it led to tension. Lennon himself was in a bit of a fragile state because Yoko had had a miscarriage a few weeks before the recording of this album, and he was also in the middle of a period during which him and Yoko were taking heroin, so that kind of helped. I don't know, none of the Beatles have been particularly kind about these sessions, but I think that with hindsight they could probably see the good things which came out of it, and in the film certainly some of the arguments and the scenes are a bit depressing when they're not getting on well, or John looks bored out of his tree. But when it works, when they're really playing well together, which is when they're playing all the finished versions of the songs, like superb video for Two of Us, with John sitting on the floor, Paul standing up, Ringo at the back with George sitting in front of him, picking out his guitar on the bass notes of his guitar. Superb video, and the same for all the rooftop concerts, good versions of Dig a Pony, I've Got a Feeling, One After 909, Get Back, Don't Let Me Down, which didn't appear on the album, just on the B-side. It appeared later on Let It Be Naked, which I'll come to. And one of the interesting things about this album is that John and Paul are singing harmony on several tracks, which hardly happened on the White Album. I think Happiness is a Warm Gun were one of the tracks where they did sing together, but on here, they sing together on I've Got a Feeling, Dig a Pony, One After 909, Get Back, and Don't Let Me Down. So that's 4 right there, 4 or 5. So, yeah, the tracks, I don't know if I'll go through all of them. The only track which maybe isn't top drawer is Dig a Pony, but it's still interesting musically. It's a kind of bluesy number with nice guitar from George. I think Two of Us is a top-notch track, and I think Phil Spector did a good job to open the album with it. Even though Get Back is a natural choice to open the album, it's also an excellent choice to close the album, as he did. And I like the way he opens it with John's I Dig a Pygmy by Charles Hawtrey and the Deaf Aids. Phase 1, in which Doris gets her oats. I think it's a good, humorous beginning, and he uses material like that all the way through the album to its benefit. And when Let It Be Naked, this album, came out, it was missing all of that dialogue, which kind of made it less personal and less intimate. And whereas on this Phil Spector album, one really feels, I know it's all put together and doctored, so it's not flowing in the sequence in which it was recorded, but after Dig It, John says that was Can You Dig It by Georgie Wood, and now we'd like to do Arc the Angels Come, which is a slightly mischievous intro into the Let It Be track on this album. I'm not sure if he said it as an intro to them recording Let It Be in the studio, maybe, but it's very interesting. And the beginning of For You Blue, Lennon saying Queen says no to pot smoking FBI members. So all of that is missing. So that's one of the detriments of this album, Let It Be Naked, although it was a worthy project and I'm glad they did it. So what they did is they took the album and they took off the strings and the orchestration and the female backing vocalist, particularly noticeable on Long and Winding Road. But they also kept some of Spector's basic production work, such as Two of Us doesn't sound very different at all. I've Got a Feeling is inferior on here because the guitars are mixed lower in the mix, and one of the things Phil Spector's good at is making sure the guitars are loud enough, and he does that to superb effect on the Let It Be album, particularly on I've Got a Feeling and Get Back. Those are the two which spring to mind. But and then other tracks like For You Blue, not very different. Dig a Pony, not very different. Don't Let Me Down is an improvement on the single, the George Martin produced one. Does it credit a producer on this Naked album or not? I can't remember. Not on the sleeve anyway. Across the Universe is quite interesting. Basically a version without Spector's strings, but without those rather rubbish female vocalists either. So just a stripped down version of that. Let It Be is an interesting outtake. There were several solos done. There was this solo, which I think is the one, or very similar to the one used in the film, recorded January the 30th, 1969, and then George was unhappy with that solo, and for the Let It Be single, he went and recorded it again on 30th of April 1969. That's the version which came out on here, backed by You Know My Name, look up the number. And then on January the 3rd and January the 4th, 1970, George, Ringo and Paul gathered in Abbey Road for the last Beatles sessions. John was in Denmark, couldn't make it. They recorded I Me Mine, which was in the film, needed a version of that. They hadn't been properly recorded. So they recorded a very short version of that, 1.5 minutes. Phil Spector very cleverly made it longer. So it's about 2.5 minutes on this album. And then on January the 4th, George overdid another guitar solo on top of the backing track for Let It Be, and that turned up on the album. And that's, in my opinion, by far the best of the three guitar solos. And I was talking to my son Tommy earlier about this, and he agreed. It's much raunchier, it's much louder in the mix. There's no effects. On the single version, there's some rather strange effects, and it sounds a bit like a kind of organ in the distance. Whereas on the album, it's up front, in your face, and it works tremendously. So, One After 909 recorded live on the roof. I think it's the only track on the album which was recorded on the roof, although they make it appear as if all the rest was. And then, of course, the album finishes brilliant touch at the end of Phil Spector to put on Lennon's remark at the end of the rooftop concert. We'd like to say thank you on behalf of the group and ourselves, and we hope we pass the audition, which is about as good a close to the Beatles' career as you could wish for. I mean, the Abbey Road close, and in the end, the love you take is equal to the love you make, is also sublime in another way, in a more sophisticated, polished way. But this album is a little loose around the edges, and I'm glad Phil Spector made it a little bit of a smoother listen by softening up some of the tracks and making them more palatable. And there's a couple of wrong notes on the Glyn Johns version. And even on the anthology, some of the outtakes they chose for the anthology, like I've Got a Feeling, there's a wrong note on there, which I have no idea why they put that out. But anyway, so that was Let It Be Naked and the album. And then I have my US copy, which was a gatefold. Picked this up in New York not too long ago. And then this is an Australian copy, which is a slightly smaller sleeve, which is interesting. And then this is the new vinyl, which looks superb. And slightly different picture on the back. I mean, in terms of the pictures have been enhanced, I guess improved, but they look a little grayer on the new vinyl, on the back cover there. Anyway, and then this book came out, Get Back, the Beatles' Let It Be disaster, which chronicles very interestingly every single track laid down on every single day. The guys had obviously been given access to the tapes, and it's fascinating to read. Doesn't quite tell you what happened on January the 10th, still the argument between John and George. And I don't like the way it's titled, The Beatles' Let It Be Disaster, because I think it was far from a disaster. I think it's got a lot, it was in my top 3 Beatles albums for a start. I think it's got a lot to recommend it. I think some of the Beatles' most timeless songs are on it. Title track, Get Back being 2 of them, but not only that, Across the Universe and 2 of Us being 2 of my all-time favourites as well. And I've Got a Feeling is one of Paul's best ever rockers. So underrated album for sure. We're looking forward to the 50th anniversary next year, and the film, of course, with all the extras, and the more extras the better, because I can't get enough of watching the good stuff, and they don't have to show 50 hours, but they could show the best 10 or 12, and I don't think the fans would have a problem with that. So, thank you for watching. See you next time.